Max Granger didn't expect trouble when he rolled into Willow Oaks. In fact, after 4 deployments and years of military life, all he wanted was a quiet place where his son Eli could breathe easy. The house was perfect, single-story wide. Entry, quiet cul-de-sac. It even had a front yard Eli could watch birds from, safely tucked in his wheelchair beside the window. But there's always one neighbor. Her name was Karen Whitmore. Hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, walking shoes, too white to be practical, and a clipboard that never left her grasp. She showed up just as Max was setting up the portable ramp onto the front stoop. "Are you modifying the exterior?" she asked, her voice flat but carrying a tone that made Max pause. "Just a temporary ramp. My son's wheelchair can't manage those steps." Karen squinted at the ramp like it had personally insulted her. "That wasn't approved." Max held back a sigh. "It's removable. I'll fill out whatever paperwork you need." Karen gave a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The HOA has aesthetic standards. I'll bring it up with the board." She left without another word, and Max turned back toward the ramp already, regretting the conversation. Inside, Eli was giggling at their dog Banjo, who had gotten tangled in packing paper. The boy's laughter made Max smile, but behind that smile sat an unease that hadn't been there before. The first letter came 2 days later. Notice of violation. Unauthorized construction remedy within 48 hours to avoid penalties. Max walked the paper into the kitchen and dropped it on the counter like it was contaminated. He'd been there less than a week, and already he was being warned over a ramp that gave his son access to his own home. He called the HOA office. No one answered. He emailed. No reply. He left a voicemail. Crickets. But Karen showed up the next morning, right on cue. "I saw your ramps still there," she said, holding another paper. "This is your second notice." Max took the paper, but said nothing. Karen looked over his shoulder and caught sight of Eli, seated near the window. In his motorized chair, watching cartoons, Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know, our community values harmony. That ramp is disruptive." Max turned just a little. "It's also federal law. My son has a right to access his home." Karen raised a brow. "And we have the right to enforce standards. Just because someone has needs doesn't mean they get to ignore the rules." Max stepped forward, folding the paper. "Is that official HOA policy?" Karen's mouth curled slightly. "That can be." That night, Max sat on his back porch with an old notebook open. He flipped through names of former military buddies. One stood out. Renee Wallace, JAG attorney, now in private practice. He didn't call, not yet, but he left a voice memo in her inbox. "Hey Renee, I think I've got an ADA issue. Might need your help if things get worse." The next morning, Banjo barked at the door. A new letter had been slipped under it. Notice of enforcement action. Ramp must be removed. Daily fines to begin tomorrow, and attached to the bottom, scribbled in Karen's perfect handwriting. "Your child's equipment is not our problem." Max stood there in silence. Then he walked to the fridge, opened a drawer, and took out Eli's hospital paperwork. He folded it once, placed it in an envelope, and addressed it to Renee. If Karen wanted a fight, she was about to get one. Karen didn't wait for Max to respond. By the next HOA meeting held in the beige clubhouse with lukewarm coffee and 5 regular attendees, she'd already presented a bylaw revision. She called it the Exterior Aesthetic Integrity Clause. The language was buried under technical terms, but the meaning was clear. No medical or mobility equipment could be installed in visible areas without pre-approval. And guess who sat on the approvals committee? Just Karen. Max heard about the meeting the next day from his neighbor, Mrs. Becker, kind older woman, who walked her dachshund by his house every morning. She whispered, "She's rewriting the rules, Max, all just to go after your son's ramp." Max stared at her for a beat, then gave a tight nod. "Thanks for the heads up." Later that afternoon, Max walked Eli down the street in his chair. The sidewalk had a slight tilt that made maneuvering a little tricky, but Eli was smiling, until Karen appeared like a ghost at the corner. She stood with her clipboard, watching them silently. Her eyes scanned the wheelchair like it was graffiti. "Need to remove the modifications," she said, deadpan. Max kept his voice calm. "He needs access. That ramp stays." Karen clicked her pen slowly. "Then the fines begin. And don't think about appealing, we've already voted." Max raised a brow. "Who's we?" Karen didn't answer. That night, Max came home to another paper taped to his door. A fine had already been assessed to $250. The date was that very morning. He took a picture of it and sent it to Renee with a simple message. It started. 2 days later, Eli's physical therapist Shonda arrived for her weekly session. She was upbeat as always, carrying a bag of supplies and a folder of progress notes. Except this time, she didn't make it inside. Karen had parked her SUV sideways at the front entrance of the neighborhood, blocking Shonda's vehicle. She stood there waving her clipboard like a wand. "You're not on the approved guest list," she said, "and you're not a resident." "I'm a licensed therapist with medical clearance," Shonda said firmly. Karen didn't budge. "Not today. You're not." Shonda took out her phone and hit record. "You're interfering with a medical service for a disabled child." Karen blinked, then laughed. "Don't be dramatic." Back at the house, Max was on the phone with Renee. She listened quietly before asking him to describe the ramp, the HOA's letters, and Karen's latest stunt. Then she said something that changed the tone entirely. Max, this is serious. What she's doing isn't just wrong, it's illegal. She's violating Eli's civil rights. Max sat back, gripping the phone tighter. You're saying I've got a case? You don't just have a case, Renee said. You've got a situation that the Department of Justice would take an interest in. Max looked out the window, watching Eli in the living room with Banjo. He felt his chest tighten not from fear, but something heavier, a storm building inside. He'd kept quiet, tried being reasonable, but this wasn't just HOA politics anymore. This was personal. He ended the call and got to work. First, he printed every letter Karen had delivered. Then the HOA bylaw changes. Then screenshots of emails, neighbor testimonies, even footage from his own door camera of Shonda being turned away. He put it all into a binder and added one more thing at the front, a photo of Eli smiling with a bluebird perched on his chair tray. He mailed the packet to Renee by overnight courier. The next day, he walked Eli to the park. As they turned the corner, Karen stood near her SUV again, clipboard in hand. But this time, Max stopped. You think you're untouchable? He said. That clipboard won't save you. Karen gave a small laugh. I have rules. What do you have? Max met her eyes. Lawyers. And receipts. The morning Karen opened the envelope, she didn't expect her hands to shake. But there it was in bold type. A notice of formal ADA investigation into the Willow Oaks Homeowners Association, specifically citing multiple violations linked to her conduct as acting HOA president. She stood frozen in her entryway, a cold draft slipping in from the open door. It wasn't just legal jargon. It was personal. The words retaliatory behavior, discriminatory enforcement, and interference with access struck like nails on a chalkboard. She slammed the door shut and paced across the hardwood floors. For the first time since she claimed control of the HOA board 3 years ago, she felt something unfamiliar pressing in. 2 days later, a rental sedan pulled up outside Max Granger's house. A woman in a navy blazer stepped out, adjusting her ID badge as she approached the front door. Max opened it before she knocked. Renee Wallace, she said with a small grin. I come bearing both paperwork and trouble for your least favorite neighbor. Max smiled back. You have no idea how good the timing is. Inside, Eli was playing with Banjo, who barked once before sniffing Renee's briefcase. Max introduced them, and then Renee got down to business. She opened a thick folder on the dining room table. Your documentation was perfect. I've filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. They've opened a preliminary investigation. The HOA board will be notified, and Karen will be required to respond in writing. Max raised a brow, and if she doesn't, she faces a federal penalty. This is no longer just about fines, it's about civil rights interference. Renee leaned in, and she may have already made it worse by modifying the bylaws without board approval. Karen, meanwhile, was in damage control mode. She summoned the remaining board members, 3 tired retirees, who were more interested in potlucks than politics, to an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. I've received a complaint, she began, but it's baseless, a misunderstanding, at best. Ron, the board's treasurer, tilted his head. Karen, they're accusing us of violating federal disability law. No, me, she snapped before catching herself. I mean, they're targeting me as a scapegoat. I was protecting the community. Diane, the secretary, spoke next. Said you blocked a therapist from entering the neighborhood. Is that true? Karen waved it off. She didn't have clearance. Anyone can claim they're a therapist. She's licensed and works with a child, Ron said quietly. A disabled child? Karen's throat went dry. The meeting ended without any motions, just quiet tension. Back at Max's house, things weren't quiet at all. The next morning, they woke to shouting outside. Max opened the door to find 2 private security guards contracted by the HOA standing in front of the ramp. We've been instructed to remove this structure. One said, you're joking, Max replied, stepping between them and the ramp. No, sir. Orders came from the acting HOA president. Said it's a violation and needs to be dismantled by sundown. Eli, watching from inside, looked confused. Max clenched his jaw. You touch that ramp, and you'll answer to my lawyer and federal law. One guard shrugged. We don't want trouble, just doing what we were paid to do. Renee arrived minutes later. She stepped out of her car and flashed a gold DOJ legal liaison badge. You just attempted to remove federally protected accessibility infrastructure in front of a minor with a documented disability. I suggest you leave immediately before this escalates. The guards backed off fast. Later that night, the story got worse for Karen. Doorbell footage from Max's porch, capturing the guards, confronting him, and the crying sound of Eli when they approached the ramp, was uploaded by another neighbor, who had also been recording from across the street. Within hours, the video spread online. Comments poured in. Is this even legal? Poor kid. What kind of HOA is this? Someone stop that clipboard tyrant. Karen prided herself on staying ahead of the neighborhood gossip until she became it. By mid-morning, the video had jumped from local mom groups to a popular HOA horror stories page. From there, it trickled onto national disability rights accounts. Each repost came with a flurry of outrage, and before noon, Karen's name was burned across every phone in the Willow Oak zip code. She tried to ignore the pinging on her phone. She even turned off the comments on her personal social media, but it was too late. People had screenshots, people had stories, and they were finally talking. Max didn't post anything. He didn't have to. Others did it for him. Neighbors who once kept quiet now sent messages, some apologizing for not stepping in sooner. Others expressing disbelief over how far Karen had gone. One of them was Mrs. Becker. She stopped Max as he checked his mail. "I just saw the video," she said, eyes watery. "That poor boy. I never knew it got that bad. If you need someone to speak to the board, I will. And so will my sister. She's a nurse and she's furious." Max gave her a thankful nod. "We're not backing down this time." Meanwhile, at the HOA clubhouse, the fallout had just begun. The board gathered again, this time without Karen calling the meeting. Ron had done that. He sat at the center of the table with the doorbell footage paused on his tablet. "This is a problem," he said, "a real one. We're facing federal scrutiny, media attention, and possibly a lawsuit because Karen took matters into her own hands. She didn't just overreach," Diane added. "She acted without a vote. I checked the logs, there was no motion for those security guards. That ramp removal order was hers alone." The third member, Alan, just shook his head. "We let her run everything. We stopped paying attention. That's on us." Ron tapped the table. "Not anymore. I'm drafting a motion to suspend her effective immediately." Karen found out hours later when she walked into the clubhouse and saw her name missing from the leadership board. A printed notice hung near the bulletin, effective immediately. Karen Whitmore is suspended from all HOA duties pending legal review. Her face flushed. She turned and stormed out, dialing the board hotline. No one answered. She left 5 messages in 15 minutes. By the 6th, she stopped calling. That night, Renee returned with news Max didn't expect. "The DA has elevated the case," she said. "They're treating it as a pattern of discriminatory enforcement, and they've approved a full civil rights audit of the HOA's recent activities." Karen's actions opened the entire board up for inspection. Max sat back, stunned. "Does that mean they'll investigate the fines? The bylaw changes?" Everything, Renee confirmed. Every single letter, vote, amendment, and every dollar she issued in fines over the last 12 months. Max gave a low whistle. She's going to lose more than her clipboard. Night wasn't quiet. She sat in her darkened kitchen, ignoring texts from her friend group, ignoring the knock on her door, ignoring the voicemail from her cousin telling her she needed a lawyer. Instead, she scrolled through the latest thread. On a national HOA watchdog forum, someone had uploaded documents fines she'd issued, complete with signatures that suspiciously all looked the same. Commenters began dissecting each one. A user tagged a disability rights attorney. Another claimed to be a paralegal already, drafting a class action complaint. Karen slammed the phone down. Her eyes were wide now, her pulse racing. The walls that once protected her were closing in. The next morning, something she never expected appeared at the foot of her porch. A woman with a badge and a clipboard, not hers, stood patiently at the door. "Ms. Whitmore?" the woman asked when Karen finally opened it. Karen nodded slowly. "My name is Agent Cummings. I'm with the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Fair Housing Division. I'm here to conduct an interview regarding a potential violation of federal law." Karen tried to close the door, but the agent slid a formal notice between the frame. "This is official. Refusing to comply may result in further legal consequences." Karen stood there, frozen, while the birds chirped peacefully in the background. Ron never considered himself a man of confrontation. As the HOA treasurer, his job was mostly numbers: collect dues, pay landscapers, and make sure the sprinklers didn't bankrupt the budget. But sitting in front of the HUD auditor, watching spreadsheet after spreadsheet project onto the clubhouse wall, he felt like he was staring down the barrel of something much bigger than financials. Karen had always insisted the HOA needed tighter control. What no one realized was how thoroughly she had bent the system to serve her own agenda, and now, it was all being unwrapped line by line. HUD Agent Cummings stood at the front of the room with a laser pointer and a quiet, serious tone. "This column shows fines issued in the past 18 months. A typical HOA of this size averages 40 to 50 minor violations per year. Yours." She clicked to the next slide. 212. A gasp rose from the few board members present. Diane leaned forward. "Is that right?" Agent Cummings nodded. "What's more concerning is the pattern. Nearly half of these violations were directed at households with either elderly residents or individuals with disabilities, and 78% were issued solely by your then acting president without full board approval." She turned to Ron. "Were you aware of this?" Ron's face was pale. "No, she told us those were routine. She said the rules had to be enforced consistently." Agent Cummings didn't answer. She didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Back at Max's house, Renee laid out the next steps. The audit is only the start. They're expanding the investigation into Karen's financial handling. Some of the fines may have gone into personal accounts. Max blinked. You mean she might have? Yes, Renee said quietly. There's evidence she opened a second HOA account, unlisted under her name and one board cosigner. That cosigner never existed. Max leaned back. The room felt heavier. She didn't just discriminate, he said. She profited from it. Across the street, Karen sat in her living room with the curtains drawn, reviewing an email chain from the HUD legal team. Words like embezzlement, misuse of funds, and false documentation stared back at her. She kept scrolling until she found the one that made her stop breathing. Federal referral, United States Attorney's Office, Disability Rights Division. The weight of it all finally hit. She had gone to four and someone bigger than her clipboard was watching now. The next day, the HOA board reconvened. For the first time in years, the seats were full. Ron stood at the front and cleared his throat. We owe this community a deep apology. We failed in our oversight, and we allowed a single member to weaponize this board against families, seniors, and the disabled. That ends today. He looked toward Max, seated near the back with Eli and Banjo by his side. We're issuing a formal statement of apology to the Granger family. We're also reimbursing every disability-related fine issued during Karen Whitmore's tenure, and we're submitting our full cooperation to federal investigators. Applause broke out, quiet at first, then stronger. Karen wasn't there, but she would hear it. The neighborhood had changed. That evening, something arrived at Karen's home. Not a fine, not a warning, a court summons. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. 2 civil suits filed against her, one by the Granger family, and the other by a group of former residents she'd fined and harassed. The papers were stamped and sealed. Her name in bold, her future uncertain. She sank into the kitchen chair and stared at the walls that once made her feel in control. Now, they felt like they were closing in. The courtroom wasn't large, but the silence inside it made it feel like a vault. Karen Whitmore walked in wearing a blazer, one shade too bright, her hair pinned up like she was applying for a country club committee, not facing 2 civil lawsuits and the beginning of a federal probe. She had declined a jury trial. That was a mistake. Judge Esther Rowley didn't play dress-up justice. She sat tall, eyes sharp beneath the bench. As she reviewed the files stacked before her, Karen stood next to her newly hired attorney, her third, after the last 2 dropped her case quietly. The latest one looked barely 30 and already exhausted. Max Granger sat 2 rows behind the prosecution table with Eli beside him. Banjo wasn't allowed in the courtroom, but Eli held a stuffed version in his lap. His eyes were wide, but calm. He knew something was happening, something big. Renee Wallace stood as the plaintiff's attorney and began with quiet force. Your Honor, this is not just a neighborhood dispute. This is about a child, a disabled child who was denied his basic right to access and safety, who had his lifeline tampered with by a woman who saw his condition not as protected, but as a nuisance. She handed over exhibits, photos of the ramp, the citations, the denied therapist log, and the footage on up to God standing at Max's door while Eli cried in the background. Karen didn't flinch, but her lawyer did. Judge Rowley turned to Karen. Ms. Whitmore, do you have a statement? Karen stepped forward. Her voice for the first time was unsure. I acted in the best interest of the neighborhood. The rules were clear. I was simply enforcing them. The judge raised an eyebrow. Did those rules include denying medical personnel access to a disabled minor's home? Karen hesitated. They didn't follow proper procedure. Did the procedure include the child waiting without care? The judge snapped. Karen's jaw tightened. I was trying to maintain standards. Judge Rowley leaned back. You're about to learn what standards the law holds you to, Miss Whitmore. Next, Max was called to the stand. He wasn't a man who liked the spotlight, but when he looked at the judge, and then down at Elihu, gave him a small thumbs up, he knew he had to speak plainly. My son doesn't complain. He doesn't ask for much. All he wanted was to be able to roll out of the house, maybe chase the dog, see the neighbors. That rampant gave him dignity. And this woman, he gestured toward Karen, tried to take that away. He paused. She treated my son like a violation, not a person. There was no sound but the scribbling of the court reporter's pen. Rested her case shortly after. Karen's lawyer made a weak attempt to dismiss the allegations, saying she had no malicious intent. But then Renee stood and produced the final piece of evidence. A printed email Karen had sent to another HOA board member, uncovered during the audit. In it she wrote, "We can't allow this kid's contraptions to make the neighborhood look like a rehab center. If I have to bend the rules, I will." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Rowley didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Ms. Whitmore, your actions were more than reckless. They were cruel. You used your position not to serve but to suppress. I find you liable for emotional distress, ADA interference, and targeted harassment. Karen stood, frozen. I'm referring this case to the federal court system for potential criminal charges under ADA violation statutes. Outside the courtroom, a crowd had gathered. Local reporters stood by with cameras. A small group held signs that read, "Access is a right and justice for Eli." Karen pushed through them silently, avoiding eye contact. Behind her, Max and Eli emerged to a few scattered cheers. Eli looked up at his father and asked, "Did we win?" Max smiled. "We're not done yet. But today? Yeah, we did." Karen Whitmore's world narrowed to a single gray cell. The clanging of the metal door echoed through the corridor as she was led inside federal custody, the weight of reality pressing down like the cold concrete walls around her. She had always seen herself as untouchable, a queen with a clipboard and the power to dictate what the neighborhood looked like. But now, that power was stripped away. Her trial began quickly. Federal prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically, the pattern of discrimination, the false documents, the unauthorized fines, and the emotional torment inflicted on Eli and other residents. Karen's lawyer tried to plead for leniency, citing stress and misunderstandings. But the jury wasn't swayed. Max watched from the courtroom gallery, Eli at his side. The little boy's eyes sparkled when the prosecution played the footage. Again, the moment the private guards attempted to remove his ramp, his tearful face framed forever in pixels. For Max, it was a victory far beyond fines or letters. It was a statement. The jury deliberated for hours. When they returned, Karen's fate was sealed. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal custody and ordered to pay $120,000 in damages to the Granger family and others affected. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, she cast one last look toward Max and Eli. "I never meant for this, ... She started, but Max shook his head. "Maybe not," he said quietly, "but you did it anyway." Ending twist. In the months that followed, Karen's house was sold at auction. The buyers, a nonprofit dedicated to HOA compliance, intent on turning the neighborhood into a model of accessibility. And the ramp, it stayed. Not just standing, it was expanded, becoming a symbol of the fight for justice. The sun was shining brighter in Willow Oaks these days, brighter and kinder. The neighborhood had changed, and so had the stories told in its quiet streets. At the heart of it all stood a ramp. Not just any ramp, but one rebuilt, wider and sturdier, wrapped in a fresh coat of blue paint and a plaque that read, "In honor of dignity, access, and the strength to stand or roll together." Max Granger pushed Eli up that ramp with a smile that couldn't be wiped away. Banjo trotted happily beside them, tail wagging in time with their footsteps. The local nonprofit, Access for All, had stepped in after purchasing Karen's old house. Their mission was clear: transform Willow Oaks into a model community for accessibility, where no child, senior, or disabled neighbor felt unwelcome. Their team worked tirelessly, consulting with experts and residents. Curb cuts were installed, wider sidewalks paved, community events held to celebrate inclusivity. Neighbors who once whispered now spoke openly, sharing stories, volunteering, and building bonds stronger than HOA bylaws ever could. One afternoon, as Max watched Eli race Banjo along the new sidewalks, a truck pulled into the driveway of the old Whitmore house. Two smiling faces stepped out: Jake and Melissa, a couple who ran a consulting firm specializing in HOA compliance. Melissa laughed warmly as she unpacked. "We heard the neighborhood needed a fresh start." Jake grinned. "And we're here to make sure it stays that way." Word traveled fast. The neighborhood welcomed the new owners with open arms, eager to leave behind a chapter marked by exclusion and replace it with one of hope. Max found himself invited to speak at local schools and veteran events, sharing Eli's story and the importance of standing up for rights, no matter the odds. Eli, now a local hero in his own right, smiled shyly when neighbors called him the boy who rolled to victory. At the community's first annual Accessibility Day, balloons flew, children played, and the once quiet streets buzzed with celebration. Bus gave a speech, eyes scanning faces old and new. "We fought hard for what should have never been taken away. This ramp isn't just wood and nails, it's a symbol, a promise that everyone here belongs." As the sun dipped low, Max looked over at the Whitmore house. From the porch, Jake and Melissa waved, their smiles sincere nearby. A new ramp gleamed under the setting sun, no longer a battleground, but a beacon.